Sir Malcolm Rifkind.
Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Central to the concern that the House is expressing is whether the United Kingdom can be reasonably accused of interfering in the internal affairs of China. I was privileged to serve as Foreign Secretary for the final 2 years of British sovereignty over Hong Kong, and I was involved personally in the final stages of these negotiations. If it was the situation that the British government was trying to deal with, or the committee was trying to comment on matters that were not relevant either to the joint declaration or the basic law, then of course you could have a complaint, a legitimate complaint, that these are the internal affairs of China. But the question of the franchise in Hong Kong goes to the very heart of the joint declaration and the basic law. And the chairman of the committee was, of course, entirely correct to say that the suggestion that these commitments and the right of the United Kingdom government, indeed not just the right, the obligation of the United Kingdom government to take an interest in the fulfilment of these commitments, expired when sovereignty transferred to Hong Kong, is patently absurd. We have only seen 17 years pass of the 50 years for which these obligations are indeed a commitment of the Chinese government. It was an international agreement reached with Her Majesty's government, and it is, as I say, an obligation, not just an entitlement, not only for the British government but also for the committees of this House to monitor these matters and to express their views on that. May I also say that I think, and I say it in a very genuine sense, I think the Chinese government have done themselves a disservice by the step they have taken. What they have demonstrated is not their strength, it's their weakness. Because the idea that by simply issuing a veto on visas, that somehow resolves the issue, simply has not happened. Quite rightly, I understand the committee is going to continue its work, and all that has happened is some very adverse publicity for the Chinese government in a way that they could so easily have avoided. They should have welcomed the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. They should have used it as an opportunity to put to them their point of view, explaining that under their own proposals there will be a mass franchise, and explaining their justification as to why they believe the selection of the candidates should be under their control. Whether they would have persuaded the committee, of course, we cannot say one way or the other, but that is how they should have operated. But when I say they've done themselves a disservice, they've done themselves a disservice in a much wider sense than simply the implications for Hong Kong. Because part of the reason for the original commitment by Deng Xiaoping to two systems in one country was not just to find a solution for the issue of Hong Kong, but infinitely more important from the point of view of Chinese policy and Chinese national aspirations is whether Taiwan will one day agree to rejoin the motherland. And central to the Chinese government's position ever since Deng Xiaoping has been to try to reassure the people of Taiwan and the government of Taiwan, which is itself now a democratic government with a pluralist system and with the rule of law, that their way of life would not be endangered by some agreement at some stage to peacefully rejoin the People's Republic of China, or to join with China under the People's Republic. Now, of course, the controversies that are convulsing Hong Kong at the moment do enormous damage to the credibility of the Chinese government's ability to put forward that argument. They should realise that, and indeed it is astonishing that they still persist in the policy that we are debating today. Central to these issues is not just the question of democracy in Hong Kong, but also the rule of law. And the rule of law, of course, is not just about the non-political parties or the candidates or free elections. We all understand what the rule of law means. There was a very fascinating speech made by the current leader of China and a policy that was implemented by the People's Congress just a few weeks ago, when it was declared by the Chinese government that the priority objective for the immediate future was that the rule of law in China, but they described it in a specific way. They said China would be utterly committed to the rule of law with Chinese characteristics. A very interesting qualification. I remember in the days of the Soviet Union, when people referred to not just democracies, but people's democracies, you knew the very addition of that word was in practice a negation of the democracy itself. Once you start having to qualify democracy, it is an excuse to try and justify ignoring it. So when we are now committed to, in China, the rule of law with Chinese characteristics, it's worth asking what actually are these characteristics. Well, I have a reason to think I do know what they mean, and I would like to share it very briefly with the House. When I was Foreign Secretary, one of the obligations I had was to have a series of negotiations with the then Chinese Foreign Minister, Chen Chi-chen, about the handover of Hong Kong to the People's Republic. And I remember vividly one meeting I had with him in Beijing when I was saying to him that from the point of view of the people of Hong Kong, what was important to them when they became part of China was not simply that they would have elections and pluralist political system and so forth, important, very important though that was, but also that they would continue to enjoy the rule of law. Now, I knew what I meant by that, and this House would know what I meant by that, but I've never forgotten his response. The Chinese Foreign Minister said to me, "Oh, please don't worry, Mr. Rifkind. We in China, we too believe in the rule of law. In China, the people must obey the law."
That's the rule.
So I had to point out to him that when we talked about the rule of law and the people of Hong Kong, it wasn't just about the people obeying the law, it was about the government obeying the law.
That's right.
The government itself had to be under the law, it had to be an independent legal and judicial system. And it was manifestly clear that the then Foreign Minister of China not only didn't agree with me, he hadn't the faintest idea what I was saying. He could not understand that distinction. And we see it elsewhere. We see it in Putin's Russia at the moment. That governments make laws, therefore, if they don't like it, they can just either ignore it or change it with impunity. And that is a very serious matter. Can I conclude my comments simply by saying this? It is now 17 years since the transition. I think we have to acknowledge that in many fundamental respects, Hong Kong does remain very different from China. Compared to the rest of the People's Republic, it is, in comparison, an open society and a relatively free society. And I think we should commend the Chinese government for the extent to which they have indeed carried out not just much of the letter, but a significant amount of the spirit of the commitment, because otherwise Hong Kong wouldn't be the open society it still remains today. But this House, as well as the world as a whole, is conscious that these distinctions are being eroded. And in the short term, the situation is rather grim if the Chinese government is determined to nibble away wherever it can at the freedoms that the people of Hong Kong enjoy and are entitled to continue to enjoy. In the medium to longer term, the difference between China and Hong Kong and the rest of China, will erode. It will erode, but not in the direction the current Chinese government would like. It won't be by Hong Kong becoming more like China. In the longer term, it will be by China becoming more like Hong Kong, because already the pressures within China for a more open society, for a more pluralist system, for some choice in the election of their leaders, is becoming very, very significant. And already, to be fair, the Chinese government have experimented in some local elections with allowing more than one candidate and a real element of choice, albeit in a very restricted way. The final point I make is simply this. The Chinese government's current assumption with regard to pluralism and democracy and the rule of law is somehow that may suit the West, but these are Western values, not Chinese. The evidence which discounts that, which shows it to be worthless as an argument, is not what happens in the West. It is to look at the transformation of Taiwan, it's to look at Hong Kong itself, and to a significant degree to look at Singapore, all Chinese communities that not only talk about democracy but practice it, that practice pluralism, that have independent judicial systems, and that clearly corresponds to the wishes of the people whom they govern. So these are universal values that we're talking about. And I think the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and the members of that committee have done a great service, not just to this House, but to Hong Kong and to China as a whole, by opening up this debate in the way we are able to do today.